Same old story. Rick saving Mortys? We've got a brand new Citadel lore episode, bro. You're watching WhitneyVision, and this is all the Easter eggs and details you might have missed in the Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly. This is your spoiler warning! If you haven't seen Season 8, Episode 3 yet, hit pause on this video and come back once you get your mouth around it. This week's episode title, The Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly, is of course based on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, an epic spaghetti western about three gunslingers competing to find gold, and all of the stylized gunfights they get into along the way. It's one of the most iconic westerns of all time, but it wasn't the only Clint Eastwood movie they based this episode on. In an interview with Forbes, Dan Harmon said that this episode was inspired heavily by another iconic western, Unforgiven, but we'll talk about those references a little later. I will say though, Unforgiven seems to be a movie that the writers have been drawn to, considering that it was the titular inspiration for the Unmort Rickin episode from last season, which was the big showdown between Rick, Evil Morty, and Rick Prime. I'm gonna be honest with you guys up front, I haven't binge-watched a bunch of Western movies since sophomore year of film school, so if you catch a reference that I missed, definitely let me know in the comments below. Interestingly, this is the 9th episode of the series without a cold open, but that doesn't mean that the opening wasn't cold as hell anyways. The first thing we see is the floating corpse of Andy the Ampersand, the Citadel's new mascot from Season 5's Rick Murray Jack, who once proclaimed that this place wouldn't be home without Rick's Andy Mortys. Morty gets bored while the two of them clean up the floating Citadel debris and starts playing with a fidget spinner. Rick asks, didn't the Egyptians invent those? I actually did not know this, but apparently the use of fidget toys to occupy the hands and mind date all the way back to 3500 BC, with simple string toys found in ancient Egyptian tombs. So there was really some pharaoh on his deathbed like, guys, please don't forget to put the fidget spinner in my tomb in case I get social anxiety in the afterlife. That is so real of them. Please bury me with Diner Dash installed on my phone in case I get trapped in an awkward conversation with Osiris. When Rick's ship is damaged by space trash, they land on a random asteroid to fix it. There, a group of cloned Mortys who managed to escape the Citadel have built a small town, the center of which is an arcade run by Arcade Morty. Part of the crashed Citadel has been salvaged to build the arcade and the surrounding buildings. We also met up with a few of the other clones, but unfortunately for you guys, I'm gonna have to come up with names for most of them, because not all of their official names were published. First, we see Cowskull Morty playing with a yo-yo next to Bruised Eye Morty, who's reading a copy of Sex Vogue. This magazine was first shown in the background of Season 6's Solarix. We've also got two Mortys walking arm in arm, Wheat Farmer Morty and Gambler Morty. Then there's Miner Morty, who has a simple Rick salvage bin. Last but not least, there's Doc Morty, a visual reference to Deadwood's Dr. Amos Cochran. I feel like his whole not a doctor shtick is also a parody of something, possibly Doc Holliday, who was a dentist, not a physician. But I defer to any Western aficionados in the comments who can point to a more direct reference. Rick and Morty have a little catch-up convo to remind all the viewers at home what the deal is with these clones. It's been 3 seasons since our last Citadel ep, so here's a quick reminder in case you're fuzzy on the details. At the beginning of Rick Murray Jack, Evil Morty reveals that Citadel Rick started cloning Mortys to avoid the hassle of having to manufacture and hunt down naturally occurring grandsons, and also to avoid admitting that they need Mortys for any reason. These cloned Mortys are shipped across the multiverse to different Ricks to be used as sidekicks, slaves, and experiments, and their shared memories are downloaded from a copied fabrication of Morty's memories to ensure a seamless transition. These Mortys are mass-produced to be abused, tortured, and even killed by self-serving Ricks, and the Citadel guys actually got the idea to create these Morty clones from the rogue Rick who used the wall of tortured Mortys to hide his base from the Citadel. They don't have their own families or even their own identities. Even if they have their own unique interests and skills, their memories are entirely made up, and they have no basis in reality. Cloned Mortys are made to think what Ricks want them to think, and do what Ricks want them to do to further their own agendas. Each of them is seen as dispensable and replaceable, a concept that even our Morty struggles with, despite being a naturally occurring grandson raised by a loving family. He literally asks Rick if he considers him irreplaceable at the end of Fear No Mort, and it's not an unrealistic worry for him to have. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Rick isn't horrified by the wall of tortured Mortys because he loves his grandson. He's horrified because he could have achieved the same effect with like 5 Mortys and some jumper cables. Even Rick C-137, who truly loves his little buddy Morty, has exhibited deeply selfish, shitty behavior towards his many multiversal grandsons. Morty also reminds us that when Rick reset his portal fluid fluid in Celerix, all of the surviving Ricks and Mortys were sent back to their dimensions of origin. But obviously, the cloned Mortys don't have a home dimension. They were created in a lab at the Citadel, which is now in pieces in nearby space. The Morty clones also likely don't have the technological prowess to get themselves off the asteroid, even if they wanted to leave. And Mortys just aren't naturally independent creatures. They need their Ricks in the same way that their Ricks need them, even if the Ricks deny it. So it makes sense that they've stuck together and formed a little Morty society. They don't have anywhere else to go, and they're not the kind of guys who would roam off to their individual solitary corners of the asteroid Luke Skywalker style. But you know who would? Homesteader Rick. He's seemingly the only Rick on the asteroid, and lives alone tending to his corn crops and creating clone pigs. His whole hog farmer gig is an homage to Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, including the scene where Rick separates a sick pig from the healthier mutant pigs. Eastwood's character, William Money, is a former gunslinger living a reformed life as a farmer until he's forced into a conflict that allows him to partially atone for his previous sins, just like Homesteader Rick. But I'm pretty sure that Will Money's hogs didn't have conjoined heads, xenomorph pig tongues, or wolf and man faces, like they did at the beginning of the Ricklantis mix-up. Rick is like, Morty, I can't imagine anything worse than having to know what that guy's deal is, before they jet away from the asteroid, leaving us alone with a bunch of clones and a cranky cowboy. Homesteader's license plate says Booger AIDS, a callback to Rick's file labeling system first seen in Morty's Mindblowers. Summer later explains in Celerix that Rick names all of his files Booger AIDS because he can't be bothered to actually label them. When a team of asshole Rick clones descend upon the town, their ship's horn plays La Cucaracha as they land. Good choice, because it's clearly incredibly hard to kill Ricks. These guys are here to kidnap the clone Mortys in town, and it seems like it isn't the first time this has happened because the Mortys had an alarm ready to sound upon their arrival. I'm gonna call the Ricks we see in this scene Mohawk Rick, Skinhead Rick, Gunslinger Rick, Red Bandana Rick, Buff Tattoo Rick, Green Neck Bandana Mustache Rick, Whip and Bottle Rick, and Pompadour Rick. Back at the lab, we also meet Hoof Hand Rick, who's being punished for his weird hands via forced phlebotomy. It turns out that the clone Ricks have also used a portion of the crashed Citadel as a home base at an abandoned brewery on another planet. These guys have a lot of the same old school ideas that the Citadel Ricks had. They believe that Mortys are disposable, and that cloning them for their own personal gain isn't wrong. Despite being clones themselves, these clone Ricks see clone Mortys as inferior to them, but they also look down on natural-born Ricks and Mortys with equal disdain. But despite their classic Rick superiority complexes, these guys aren't nearly as far along with portal travel as the real deal. They're only able to make small portions of portal fluid at a time, which is why they're unable to venture farther out into the multiverse. However, I do have to give them props for one of their gadgets. I'm obsessed with the fighting dice. I want a set of those for D&D, dude. Rolling with disadvantage would go crazy at the table. At the new mini Citadel, we also meet a whole new batch of clone Ricks. Dweeby Scientist Rick is trying to decode a genetic sequence that will allow them to unlock the code to cloning Mortys properly, and a set of construction Ricks and a welder Rick are working to rebuild their city. We later see these guys eating lunch on top of a beam at the construction site, a nod to the 1932 photo Lunch Atop a Skyscraper, which featured several workers dining on a steel beam at the RCA building during the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York. When Oddjob Rick takes Gunslinger Rick upstairs to collect payment for the kidnapped Mortys, we enter the Rick penthouse, where we meet a whole new smattering of upper-class clone Ricks and their servant Mortys. These aren't the Ricks out on the street getting their hands dirty. The guys at the top are lounging around having dinner and a show, and although their Mortys get to work around luxury, their lives are far from luxurious. Chair Crank Morty and the Morty waiters are service workers, likely doing these jobs for free under the threat of harm. Bowler Hat Morty seems to be there willingly, but most of these Mortys' lives are only marginally better than the clones getting tortured in the breweries. None of them are free to leave, make their own choices, or develop their own personalities. Even when Doc Morty remembers a time that his Rick took him and Summer to the park, Arcade Morty points out that it was just a fabricated memory implanted by the Citadel. But these high roller Ricks are living their best lives in their new government building. We've got Whiskey Rick, Tinted Sunglasses Rick, Top Hat Rick, Lincoln Beard Rick, Cowboy Hat Rick, a Lady Rick, another Lady Rick on a date with a dude Rick, Mustache Rick, and Acoustic Guitar Lady Rick. There's actually a bunch of high-end Rick call girls in this world. We see a couple more of them towards the end of the episode. Finally, we meet Boss Hog Rick. This guy was created by the Citadel as a mascot for a restaurant called Big Rick's Gumbo Hutch, which is likely where he developed a taste for the beignets that one of his waiter Mortys brings him. He was named after Boss Hogg from the Dukes of Hazzards, and his origins and outfit are a parody of Colonel Sanders, another Southern chain mascot. I also think that his connection to Gumbo might be a slight nod to Angel Heart, a 1987 thriller with a corrupt white-suited Louisiana businessman who ends up drowning in a cauldron of savory gumbo-y goodness. This might be a stretch of a reference, so I could be wrong, but in my heart, I truly believe that someday I'll find it, the Gumbo connection, the Ricks and the Mortys and me. Homesteader Rick returns home after being shot and nearly killed by Gunslinger Rick and his gang, only to find out that they also destroyed his crops, burned his home, and killed all of his cloned hogs. Worst of all, they also defaced his Tori Amos Little Earthquake CD with shit graffiti. Now, those other Ricks might be knocking Homesteader's taste, but I believe that this CD was a huge catalyst for him becoming a Rick capable of empathy for cloned Mortys. For starters, it should be noted that this album was Tori Amos's first mainstream foray into solo work, and it itself was artistically influenced by the dissolution of her synth-pop band, Why Can't Tori Read, a band that Tori looks back on with criticism due to executive meddling. Sorta sounds like something a Rick, not directly on the Council of Ricks, but using his skills to serve their agenda, would relate to. This album features themes of growing up, the struggle to find your own voice, and the bittersweet process of becoming more independent from your family as you get older. In 1994, Amos told Times Union that, quote, "I think Little Earthquakes was really about looking at things I had to look at. My first door opening up to things I'd closed off since I was a kid. I'd numbed parts of myself so they wouldn't get hurt." And those themes seem to apply to all of our characters in a lot of different ways. Whether they want to admit it or not, it even applies to the clone Ricks in this episode, who are struggling to separate themselves from the natural-born Citadel Ricks before them. Then there are the clone Mortys, who have literally never had their own voices or the opportunity to explore their independence. There's also the general trait that all Ricks, regardless of status or hierarchy or intelligence, constantly battle with, numbing parts of themselves so they won't get hurt. Whether they do it through obsessive innovation, a thirst for revenge, or a butt ton of drugs and booze, Ricks have a long history of trying to drown their pain. And finally, most importantly, we have Homesteader Rick, who the CD belongs to. This Rick is starting over again with nothing but shame and disgrace in his past. Since the Citadel's demise, he's been trying to figure out who he is when he's not using his intelligence to harm others. He breaks into his hidden weapons cache and pulls out a golden pistol, a reference to Ringo and his golden pistol, another spaghetti western from 1966 about Johnny Oro, a man who will only kill with his golden gun for his own financial benefit. In addition to the scorched carcass of his prized two-headed hog, he also buries a locket with her picture inside the weapon hole. After fixing his drones to the underside of his truck to make it fly, Homesteader Rick discovers that Doc Morty and Arcade Morty have tagged along to avenge and rescue their kidnapped clone comrades. Clone Rick HQ is on a planet that has roughly the same weather as Palm Springs or Arizona in the summer. It's an average of 104 degrees with a high of 132 degrees. Somehow, Homestead Rick is able to determine that the bottles from the raiding Ricks came from 3 parsecs away, which is roughly a distance of 10 light years. The bottle that Rick scans also shows a list of beer-making ingredients, including yeast, water, grains, coriander, maltose, sucrose, and gelatin. Sadly, Doc Morty dies in Arcade Morty's arms during the shootout that ensues when they break into the brewery. Boss Hog Rick reveals to Arcade Morty that Homesteader Rick isn't a clone like the rest of them. He's a natural-born Rick, and the former head of Morty replication at the old Citadel. His farm is full of cloning equipment, and although he still uses it on the pigs, it's clear that he's been trying to live a quiet life to distance himself from the atrocities he committed in the past. He could have gone anywhere in the multiverse after Rick reset the portal fluid, but Homesteader Rick chose to imprison himself on an asteroid in a town run by the Mortys he helped create. His immense guilt has prevented him from using any of his talents, and he chose isolation to avoid being recruited to restart his work. Homesteader Rick uses the kidnapped clone Morty's DNA to create a giant Franken-Hulk Morty. When the monster started forming, it kinda reminded me of the scene in Rick Murray Jack where Rick uses his own blood to create a fucked up BDSM clone blob to take on the pain inflicted on him by the Citadel guards. Obviously, Homesteader's clone is a lot more fully formed than Rick's, albeit missing some tissue and tendons and flesh in some places. But it did make me think about how many different Ricks have their own unique skill sets. True, Homesteader had an entire lab and captive Mortys for his experiment, and C-137 only had a few drops of his own blood, so of course his science science project came out a little better. But it also goes to show how incredible Homesteader is at cloning Mortys. He was able to figure out the genetic code in seconds and then tweak it to suit his needs. These clone Ricks have been trying to get a single clone to appear for 3 seasons. And, like with the portal fluid, they're just light years behind the scientific ability of naturally occurring Ricks. Homesteader Rick kills 3 more clone Ricks with a triple shot from his pistol, and helps Arcade Morty evacuate the other Mortys on the La Cucaracha ship. As a final goodbye, he tells Arcade Morty to tell the others to go make some memories that aren't fabricated. During his epic battle against all the clone Ricks, Tori Amos' song Little Earthquakes plays as a background track to all the wreckage. The lyrics of the song describe the cyclical nature of the little fights that ultimately destroy a relationship, and how it doesn't take much to rip each other into pieces. In the world of the Citadel, it's always the same story. Ricks killing Mortys, Mortys killing Mortys, and Mortys killing Ricks. Because everyone is disposable, their relationships are destined to fail time and time again, with the Mortys taking the brunt of the damage. But here, Homesteader Rick finally breaks the cycle. Instead of siding with the clone Ricks and using his special set of skills for evil, he realizes that he and the other Ricks are perpetually the anchors that drown these Mortys. They only exist because he made them, and he only made them to serve other Ricks. If their relationships are truly destined to fail, it's time that Ricks suffer the consequences for a change. For once, a Rick wants Mortys he doesn't even care about to have the freedom to grow beyond him. It's honestly a huge step to go from these Mortys are disposable to these Mortys' lives have meaning, even if I don't know them or give a shit about what they do. He isn't making this decision out of an obligation to his flesh and blood family. He just finally realizes that Mortys deserve to grow beyond their Rick's desires. And you know that's rare because our Rick doesn't even go out of his way to protect other Mortys unless it's at the behest of his grandson. C-37 isn't building his own wall of Mortys, but he isn't stopping anyone else from building theirs either. He doesn't kill Rick Prime because he wants to protect the other Ricks and Mortys out there in the multiverse. He does it out of a selfish desire to avenge his dead wife. He's not even a good enough dad to know which version of his daughter is real and which is a clone. I'm still very proud of him for deciding to put his family first more this season, but I wouldn't call him an overall altruistic guy. When Gunslinger Rick confronts Boss Hog Rick in his office, there's a ton of bull-themed decor all over the place, including the desk gun that shoots out of a bull's head. Bulls are typically a symbol of financial power, which makes sense for this weird railroad tycoon character. When Oddjob Rick uses his hat to slice off Homesteader Rick's arm, that's a reference to Oddjob's slicing hat from Goldfinger. Before detonating the explosives he set around the new Citadel, Boss Hog Rick asks Homesteader if he's his dad. Homesteader accuses him of being under the delusion of the auteur myth, a film term used to describe the idea that the director is the sole creator of a film, and its final product is a direct result of their creativity alone. Basically, H-Rick is telling Boss Hog that even though he was the head of Morty replication, the whole cloning operation was more of a group effort. Even if Boss Hog sees him as the father of all clones, the reality is that Homesteader only gave a few notes on Hog's creation, while others shared in the work to make it happen. Aboard the escape ship, Arcade Morty firmly encourages the other clones to stop huddling together and finally get their own lives, explore their own passions, and stand up on their own 2 feet without any other Ricks or Mortys to prop them up. I really like this character because he's one of the rare, fully competent versions of Morty that we see in the multiverse. He's certainly nowhere near as calculating as evil Morty, but he's got his shit together, you know? He's able to think for himself, lead a group, and articulate his thoughts clearly to influence others towards positive change. I've seen a couple of theories out there about this character that I want to address. Firstly, a Redditor suggested that Arcade Morty's character was inspired by Jeff Bridges' Flynn from Tron. They both own arcades and have cool flippy hair, so I can see it. I've also seen a bunch of people theorizing that Arcade Morty is actually Slick Morty, who somehow survived the garbage chute at the Citadel and moved on to the asteroid to start over. I think this is a really fun theory because they do share similar traits. Like Arcade Morty, Slick Morty was also a more grounded, realistic Morty, unlike his hopeful, naive clone pals. Although he didn't believe in the wishing portal, and rightfully so, his final wish was that things would eventually change for Mortys at the Citadel. And after a lot of bloodshed, things finally have changed. Evil Morty is gone. The Citadel is destroyed. The man who had the formula for cloning them is dead. The remaining clone Mortys are finally free to live their lives, just like Slick Morty wished for. before. But even though I definitely see the parallels, I'm not sure that I think that these two are the same character. For starters, Slick Morty literally jumped into a giant garbage disposal, then had hundreds, if not thousands of pounds of garbage dumped on top of him. Also, Slick Morty had a barcode tattoo, which Arcade Morty does not. And while it's possible that they've updated their look over the last few seasons and a lot of trauma, Slick Morty and Arcade Morty have completely different hair and clothing styles. I don't personally think that they're the same guy, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Each of the Mortys are dropped off at their respective special interest planet. Wheat farter. Wheat farmer Morty goes to a wheat-filled planet. Cubone Morty lands on a planet with giant alien cows and tiny purple space creatures with udders. Gambler Morty heads to a casino world, and Miner Morty yearns for the mines. Surprisingly, however, Arcade Morty returns home. Despite his big speech about growing up and moving on, he chose to return to the asteroid, make graves for Homesteader and Doc, and figure things out. He's got a spaceship and a whole multiverse ahead of him, so I don't think that this is the last time we'll see Arcade Morty. This is the real loose end for me that makes me think that this episode will eventually have larger narrative implications. Not that I don't think that this episode works as a standalone, it does, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is just a springboard for the next phase of the show, a phase where Morty lifts more of the serialized weight. I know a huge talking point around this episode is that the ep made it clear that the writers seem to be closing the book on the Citadel of Rick subplot once and for all, signaling that the show is stepping away from serialized plots, returning squarely to episodic adventures. I think this could be partially true. I do think that this episode's exploration of the aftermath of the destruction of the Citadel does show that Citadel-centric stories are finished, but I also think it's laying the groundwork for future world building. The Citadel was always a means to primarily explore Rick's character through infinite foils, but now that there are dozens of Mortys spread throughout the universe, I think we're eventually going to see stories that examine Morty through his own myriad of direct parallels. Once again, a huge theme of this season is characters other than Rick taking the spotlight and learning to live on their own terms. I wonder how this will eventually be reflected in the Mortys that are solely independent versus our Morty who's still growing up under Rick's influence. This doesn't necessarily mean that Arcade Morty and company will become evil Morty level antagonists, but perhaps they'll be akin to his version of Space Beth. So, while the Citadel proper's plot seems to be done, I don't think we're totally finished with the show exploring the ripple effects of the Citadel. I see this in a similar vein to how Rick and Morty's sister show, Solar Opposites, does their wall subplot. Each time the show returns to this story, it evolves in drastic ways. So I believe eventually we will come back to the Morty diaspora plot thread, and it will evolve into something else that we can't quite predict in this moment. After finding Morty's fidget spinner and accusing Arcade Morty of murder, Rick admits that Morty was right about where he left his toy. Yet another sign that, like I said in my last video, he's trying harder to be the grandpa and dad that his family needs him to be. Those are all the Easter eggs and details that I could find in the Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly, but I want to know if there's anything I missed in the comments. Like and subscribe to WhitneyVision, know that your fighting dice will outlive you, and be sure to check out my podcast, Guardians of the Galaxy with Tommy Bechtold and MT. I'm Scarlet Wit, and you're watching WhitneyVision.